Email 34 the Guam is called to order. For the prayer, we'll send the Signage climb league leaders.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we ask that you send your Spirit down upon us and grant us the wisdom necessary to understand your will. We are coming back into session to do the people's work, and we need your wisdom and your guidance to keep us focused on the needs of our community and the importance for us to balance the duties in front of us with the responsibilities we have to the people that we serve. We come before you, Lord, and we ask that as you send your Spirit down upon us, you do so in a manner that's going to ensure that we're going to be ever mindful of those who depend on us, most especially the poor and the families that struggle in our community. We ask that you help us to open our hearts and our minds not only to their circumstances, but to the perspectives of those on this floor and all of those impacted in this community by the actions we take. We put our trust in you, Lord, today as in all things. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
For the recognition of a recipient, Imilazan Mastakulu na Sacrificio, Senator Lee, you are recognized.
Situus Masi, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of a grateful island and country, we honor Native Seaman Second Class Jesus Cruz Cruz of World War II and the family of Native Seaman Second Class Jesus Cruz for making the ultimate sacrifice in service and defense of our island and country.
For the Inifresi.
Inifresi. Gininimastaculo ginasoku, imastaculum gin corazono, zanimasfigu, naninasinyahu, hu ofrecen maisadzu, parabai protehi, zanu defendi, I hinengi, I cultura, I linguahi, I airi, I hanum, zanitanu tamoru. Niran shakuriratsu ginanas duas tata, esti hua fitma, gihilui biblia, zani banderahu, I banderan guahan.
Senator Munya, if you'd please lead us in song.
Para
Clerk, please read the roll.
Senator Atta, Senator Uggan, Senator Castro, Speaker Cruz, Senator Espadon, Senator Esteves, Senator Lee, Senator Morrison, Senator Munoz, Senator Nelson, Senator Rodriguez, Senator San Augustine, Senator San Nicolas, Vice Speaker Terlahi, Senator Torres. Mr. Speaker, there is a quorum.
Thank you. Mr. Majority Leader, you note for the record the presence of Senator Nelson.
Mr. Speaker, I move to approve the Legislative Journal dated May 21, 2018, subject to corrections.
On the motion to approve the Legislative Journal dated May 21st, 2018, hearing no objection, motion carries. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, there are communications and petitions, and I move that they be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion, the communications and petitions be appended to today's session journal, hearing no objections, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, there are messages from Imagalahin Guahan, and I move that they be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion, the messages from Imagalahin Guahan be appended to today's session journal, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, there are reports of standing committees, and I move that they also be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion, the reports of standing committees be appended to today's session journal, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, there are no reports of select committees.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I move that bills introduced, bills number 288-34LS and 289-34LS and Bill 290-34COR through Bill 307-34COR. Resolutions introduced, resolution numbers 433-34LS through 438-34LS and resolution 439-34COR through 464-34COR, and certificates introduced, certificate numbers 253-34LS through 258-34LS and certificate number 259-34COR through 261-34COR be deemed to have been given their first reading.
On that motion, hearing no objections, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, I move to excuse senators not present for today's legislative session.
On that motion, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, I move that all congratulatory, commendatory, and condolence resolutions and legislative certificates introduced today and for the remainder of this legislative session be considered first read and adopted, and to allow the Legislative Council to make technical corrections and to add all senators as co-sponsors.
On that motion, hearing no objection.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I would like to add the move to place the following appointments on the session agenda. I move from the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation, I move to place the appointment of Dr. Lisa Cooper-Nurse, EDD, to serve as an EDD member of the Guam Commission for Educator Certification, to be placed on the session agenda.
On that motion, hearing no objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I move to place the nomination of Dr. Lisa Cooper-Nurse. with a recommendation to do confirm and move it to the voting file.
On that motion, hearing no objection, motion carries.
From the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation, I move to place the appointment of Candy C. Okuhama to serve as a member of the Alcohol Beverage Control Board to be placed on the session agenda.
Hearing no objection, so ordered.
Okay, all right. I also, notwithstanding the House rules, from the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation, I move to place the appointment of Renee A. Linetta to serve as a member of the Alcohol Beverage Control Board to be placed on the session agenda.
On that motion, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules from the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation, I move to place the appointment of Geraldine M. Leon Guerrero to serve as a member of the Alcoholic Beverage Control Board to be placed on the session agenda.
On that motion, hearing no objection, motion carries.
So I guess we go to the legislative concurrence.
Do you have Geraldine?
Yes, I added on
Okay, on that motion.
Geraldine Leon Guerrero.
On that motion, hearing no objection, so ordered.
Okay. Then,
Any other motion? Senator,
so then now the motion is to
ahead.
send these nominations down to the voting file.
on that motion to send all these nominations to the voting file, any objection? Hearing no objection, motion carries.
All right.
Did you have a motion? You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to place resolution, I'd move to dissolve into the committee in the whole.
Mr. Speaker,
To-
if I may, I'm sorry. My mistake. I still have more nominations here that needs to be put on, to be moved
All right.
into the voting file.
Please.
Okay. So, Speaker, I move to place the following from the Committee on Guam, U.S. Military Buildup, Infrastructure, and Transportation. The committee reports out the nomination of William D. Beery to serve as a licensed general building contractor member of the Guam Building Code Council with a recommendation to do confirm to be placed in the voting file.
Hearing no objection, so a motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, from the same committee, the nomination of Thomas P. Camacho to serve as a structural engineer member of the Guam Building Code Council with a recommendation to do confirm to be placed in the voting file.
Hearing no objection,
Mr.
So ordered.
Speaker, from the same committee, the nomination of D.D.S. Camacho to serve as a member of the A.B. Wampad International Airport Authority Board of Directors with a recommendation to do confirm to be placed in the voting file.
on the motion, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, from the same committee, the nomination of Amanda M. Catherine to serve as a general public member familiar with barrier-free architecture of the Guam Building Code Council with a recommendation to do confirm to be placed in the voting file.
Hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, from the same committee, the nomination of Frank J. Pangilinan to serve as a licensed real estate professional member of the Guam Building Code Council with a recommendation to do confirm to be placed in the voting file.
Hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, from the same committee, the nomination of Catherine C. Scroll to serve as a member of the A.B. Wampad International Airport Authority Board. Board of Directors with a recommendation to do confirm to be placed in the voting file.
On that motion, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Yeah.
On motion, Senator Esteves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to dissolve into the Committee of the Whole to discuss Resolution 239 as to whether or not it should appear on the session agenda before this body. Resolution 239-34 relative to the Committee on Ethics and Standards, findings of acts committed by Senator James V.S. Baudon, which violated the Code of Ethics and Standards, and the committee's recommendations for disciplinary action. I'd like to discuss the motion, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, this issue was brought up at the Committee on Rules meeting. It did not get a second to be placed on the agenda, and so I object to placing this thing on the agenda.
Thank you, Mr.
On
Speaker,
that-
but
on
I
that
still
motion-
have the floor to speak on the motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To clarify, the motion is to dissolve into Committee of the Whole so this body can discuss the merits as to whether an ethics resolution should be motioned and moved onto the session floor, notwithstanding the House rules. Yes, it is true, Mr. Speaker, that there was a move in the Rules Committee to place this onto the session agenda, Mr. Speaker. But this is a question, and this resolution speaks to the very integrity of this body as a whole. And that question belongs to the body, Mr. Speaker. And that's why I make this motion to dissolve into the Committee of the Whole.
You would have to make a motion to first place it on the agenda, and then you can move to place it on the...
So the motion is,
It has to be, I've just been advised by the parliamentarian, the first motion is to place on the agenda. And if it succeeds, then we can address your second motion, but currently...
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I move to place Resolution 239-34 onto the session agenda.
On that motion, Senator Vice Speaker, did your hand go up on Senator Esteves' motion?
I'd just like to ask parliamentarian if this motion is required for this matter to be considered by the legislature, or if it's automatic if there's been a recommendation by the committee.
We'll take a short recess. The legislature's back in order. Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was just asking the question because I was not at that rules meeting. I was off island, but I was not sure what the new resolution had said. If there was a new resolution by the committee, I've been assured that it says the same thing, that the committee had recommended the body's approval of their resolution. And so I just, nothing personal, but I just wanted to make sure that if we're going to assign these committees to do all this work, and then, and let's resolution for everyone. But my understanding from our parliamentarian is that it does require a vote to put it on the agenda. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All right. On the motion to place the resolution on the agenda, is there an objection? Here.
I just have a question, Mr. Speaker, for the individual making the motion. If the point of inquiry, Mr. Speaker, was any new evidence presented to result in a change in the findings of the committee?
As I read it, there was no new evidence. It was just a re-vote because there was a question about the vote the first time, and they re-voted, and they had all the votes. Okay? Hearing no objection. Oh, is that an objection? Objection. All those in favor of placing yes. It's just a place on the agenda, and there's an objection. We'll just vote, and then we'll go from there.
Mr. Speaker, I
go
believe,
ahead.
Yes, thank you. You know, this isn't easy for me. I guess I understand people think that this is some personal push against an individual. Mr. Speaker, please, I have the floor. But the truth is, Mr. Speaker, this speaks to the very integrity of this body. Mr. Speaker, regardless of what this body finds at the end result of any investigation, including if it was against me, I wouldn't be fighting against it, Mr. Speaker, because we have a job to do. We all have a job to do. We all have individual responsibilities. And I don't believe that it's appropriate, regardless of the situation, regardless of who's involved, when you're being fair and impartial, that's both in good situations and bad situations, Mr. Speaker. And so while it can appear that maybe I have an axe to grind, I really don't. I just have a responsibility. There's a clear difference. And so with this, Mr. Speaker, this is the last thing that I'm able to do within my power as an elected representative to ensure that the person who filed the complaint, regardless of who it is, whether it's somebody affluent or it's somebody off the street, that if they file a complaint within the rules of this body, that they get a resolution to the matter. Everybody deserves that, Mr. Speaker. We all voted on those rules.
Thank you.
And so that's the intent of this motion. It's nothing personal, but we just have a job to do. Thank you.
Thank you. On that motion, all those in favor of the resolution being placed on the agenda, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. Any other motion? Mr. Majority Leader, do you have a motion? Yes, on motions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Good morning to you and our colleagues. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move. My understanding is this particular piece of legislation was reported out and finalized as of Friday afternoon and was filed with the clerk's office. So I'd like to move for the placement of Bill number 270, that's 34 COR, on the legislative agenda, please.
I'm not sure if CORE has reported it. As I understand it, 262 and 270 are both at CORE, and it hasn't been reported out of CORE yet.
Then, Mr. Speaker, as we proceed with session, I would like to request the consideration of the chair.
Both you and the 262, I have on. I thought that was going to be this morning's agenda. I wanted it to be this morning's agenda. It unfortunately is not cleared. I'm not going to start with. So yes, as soon as it clears, you will both be notified, and you can both move them on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
That was the intent of this session. Okay. Mr. Majority Leader, you're recognized. I believe that we're in second reading, but I just wanted you to.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, so we're on second reading, and I move to place Bill 154-34 COR as corrected by the prime sponsor and amended by the Committee on Environment, Land, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform on the third reading file, and I'd like to discuss it.
Hearing no objection, you may proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Bill 154-34 COR is a bill which will do two things. One, it will permit the erection of off-premise signage. The current law that we have right now does not allow for off-premise signage. And it will also regulate these new signs that will be allowed. Mr. Speaker, the statute that we have which regulates outdoor signage is about 40 years old, and it allows only for what is known as on-premise signage, which means that a lot of these signs that you would, for example, see in front of the Agana Shopping Center advertises for the services that are being made available on that particular premise. With the off-premise signs, such as you would see in front of the ITC building across from FHP, there's advertisements that are provided there of services and products that are provided elsewhere, but not on that premise where you would find the sign. So it is argued that managed properly, off-premise signage can provide significant public and economic benefit, including the ability to disseminate important public service announcements in a timely manner, such as amber alerts and storm warning. Now, just going through a few the salient points of the bill, on page 5 of the bill, it stipulates there that in order to put up a off-premise sign, a permit will be needed. And this permit, an application is submitted to the Department of Public Works along with information that will be required. And Public Works will have a specific time frame with which to review the application, pass it through to the Municipal Planning Council, to the mayor, where of the municipality where the signs is to be put up, so that they can provide their input, and the DPW must basically complete their vetting process within 45 days. Now, if the application is rejected, the applicant, of course, is given the option of appealing that rejection to the Guam Land Use Commission, and that appeal, of course, must be submitted to the Guam Land Use Commission within 15 days that they receive the notice of rejection for the sign. There's also the requirement that once an approval is given to be able to put up these signs, you have 1 year. The applicant has 1 year to construct that sign and put it into operation. And the reason for that is because there's other requirements in the bill which basically regulates the intervals within which these signs can be provided, can be erected. There will be a permit fee for each application of $400, and permits are to be renewed every 4 years. And that's important because sometimes once it's erected, there sometimes may be the tendency to just, let it go on automatic pilot and not pay proper attention to the sign, such that then over time it becomes a blight on the landscape. There are reasons on page 7 that are stipulated as to reasons for revoking a permit. So, for example, after it's constructed, alterations are made to the sign structure, which makes the sign non-compliant. Now, there's also certain prohibitions that off-premise signs will not be allowed on property that is zoned residential or agriculture. There's regulations regarding the measurement of the signs, limiting it to 200 square feet. And that 200 square feet is actually based on a model from the industry that a sign that size, given the speed limit on Guam, really is adequate to be able to provide the kind of visibility that is needed. Unlike, for example, in Las Vegas, where you're driving at much higher speed, you probably need the much larger sign so you can see it from a greater distance. But on Guam, that's really not necessary. Now, probably the most important part is, and if I could have, pass these out, please. There are setback requirements for these signs. On page 9, you will see there a table that requires that a sign must be placed, cannot be placed closer than 100 feet from an intersection where there's a traffic light. And that really actually is so that, you don't have drivers there while they're waiting for the light to change, are sitting there busy reading the sign and then causing a backlog of traffic. The other part is the interval between signs. Now, on page 9, unfortunately, I'm going to have to make an amendment there because it says there are 35,000 feet, but it should be actually 3,500 feet, is the interval between signs. So what's being passed out right now is an example of what you would find how this bill would regulate the interval between signs. So everybody knows, everybody has seen that digital sign that's in front of the Docomo building. From there to the intersection of the ITC, that's approximately 3,500 feet. So if passed, what this bill says is that you will not see another digital sign between where the Docomo building is and up where the ITC intersection is. So that's basically how this regulation will fit in. So that you see that on figure 1. It shows there a radius of 3,500 feet. And if that sign that's up there in front of the ITC, if it was not there right now, in order for that sign to go in, it would have to go into the Guam Land Use Commission and apply for a variance so that it can come in and put it up, let's say, within 3,450 feet, for example. You'll see also on figure 2, there's a, it shows there, no, probably a better example is the, on figure 3, There's the Cube Inc. sign up there near Nissan. That's a static billboard. So from there, if that sign is there now, the next sign will have to be somewhere past the Bank of Guam, over by where the GTA building is on Route 1. So that's what this particular regulation would do, is it really limits so that we don't have a clutter of digital signboards on the landscape. And finally, the enforcement of this will rest upon the Department of Public Works. And that's shown on page 14. So, of course, there's penalties that are attendant to this for those not in violation. For example, those guilty of a violation will be subject to a civil penalty not to exceed $1,000. Should it not be corrected within 15 days of receipt of notice, additional late action civil penalty of $300 per day. So hopefully this will basically be able to fit in to our community, the use of this new digital signboards that's now available, and so I just ask then that my colleagues favorably consider this bill so that we allow these particular signs. Mr. Speaker, I need to just make that one correction on page 9, where it says in that box, in that table there, minimum distance. It shows here minimum distance between signs is, it says 35000. It should be 3,500 feet.
All right, we'll take that as an amendment then. Is there any objection to that amendment? No objection. Amendment passes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
On the bill, Speaker Cruz, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, if the author would please respond to a couple of questions, if possible. I'd just like to, I noted that in his discussion he talked about that you can have a variance. We have 15 pages of regulations, but we still have an ability to go to the Guam Land Use Commission to ask for a variance. Is that correct?
Senator Atta, do you yield?
That's correct, yes.
So, in spite of the fact that we say that there's going to be a minimum distance of 3,500 feet between signs, so between ITC and the Docomo building, we won't see another one there. But if somebody wants to build something between there, they can go to the Land Use Commission now and apply for a variance to put another one up? Is that correct?
Senator Atta, do you yield?
Well, that's correct, and but you know, there's also, there's that situation where somebody wants to put it, let's say, within 1,000 feet of the other sign. So that's one scenario where we're saying that the applicant can go to the GLUC. There's the other scenario, and I think it's a good example shown on figure 1 here, where you see the distance between the existing digital signboard in front of Docomo and the ITC intersection. That falls within the 3,500 feet interval. But if you take a look at the aerial photo, I would say that that location where the digital board is at the ITC intersection probably falls at 3,450 feet. So, you know, is that a situation that certainly can justifiably be appealed to the GLUC for a variance? That probably can be justified. Now, can you justify one that's within 500 feet? Now, that's when we start then, contributing to clutter.
Madam Speaker, on page 14, there's K, existing off-premise signage. Any off-premise signage which has been granted a variance by the Guam Land Use Commission or has been noticed of action from the Guam Land Use Commission on or before May 15, 2017, shall be deemed to be a legal, non-conforming off-premise sign and legally authorized to operate, provided that all business license requirements are met and therefore maintaining good standing. Signs which do not conform with this section must be removed immediately. My concern is, by the last statement of the author, the distance between the two may not be 3,500. And if I'm not mistaken, the distance of either one of those from the nearest stoplight is within the 100 feet of a stoplight. They've already been granted a variance in violation of both of those requirements, and there is nothing in here where there's going to be no variance allowed for it. That's my only concern about this bill. We've grandfathered the ones that are currently up. We are now going to allow for 15 pages of regulations, which can be tossed out the window with a variance request to the Guam Land Use Commission, which granted these non-conforming and grants them a license. If there was a provision in here that said no variances shall be granted for anything that does not conform to this, I might consider it because we already have some that are up. But to go through and to say we're not going to have a clutter because they're not going to be within 3,500 feet of each other, but you can go to a Guam Land Use Commission for a variance if you want to put it within 1,000 or 2,500 feet of the other. It can't be bigger than 200 feet, square feet, but if you apply to the Guam Land Use Commission and you get a variance, you can make it as big as you want. If you have, I really am concerned about where this is going. It was bad enough that we have the 5 that are currently up, and that they're within 100 feet of a stoplight. And there's not going to be they're now not only grandfathered, but there is a provision that it shall remain as a legal non-conforming and will exist forever. And then we're going to allow for God knows how many other signs that are going to go up in the future. Though we say we have 15 pages of regulations, it can all be tossed out with one variance application. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Speaker Cruz. On the bill, Senator San Augustine.
Mr. Speaker, I have a few amendments. They'll be passing it out. We can just take a minute recess.
Take a recess. Legislature's back in session. Senator Snodgrass.
Mr. Speaker, I have 4 amendments to the bill, all referenced to page 9. And the reason for the amendment is that I've been approached by several businesses and even received a bunch of emails from different businesses that they wanted to make sure that they were provided the opportunity to promote and be creative advertising throughout visual communications of their establishments, which can provide growth, profitable, and significant public and economic benefit. And if you look at the bill, it talks about the different signage, but not really too specific to a static sign versus a digital sign. The amendments I have here, the first one would be on line 1 of the page 9. It's to amend it to increase it from 200 square feet to 1,000. Now, we need to keep in mind that, number one, recently, earlier this year, we passed a bill identifying electronic signage to be 400 square feet. I've been approached by 3 businesses that said that they would like to build a billboard on their property, and they're actually looking at as much as 800 to 1,000 square foot display. The current bill identifies the height no more than 20 feet, and I'm identifying the width to be, if it comes up to 1,000 square feet, the next amendment will identify the width to be no more than 50 feet. That's how you derive at 1,000 square foot. But the way the bill is written, I have to go line by line.
We'll go seriatim. All right, go ahead. Your first amendment, you can speak on it. You can decide which one's your First Amendment.
Yeah, that'll be the first one, the 1,000 square foot. But it's broken down.
On the First Amendment for the static sign, the sign face shall not exceed 1,000 square feet. Anyone wish to be heard? Senator Ogden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I certainly understand the intent of the mover of this amendment to allow for static signs to not exceed 1,000 square feet. But I share the similar concerns that you shared on the floor, is that any variance or any deviation from the existing sign code should go through a regulatory body, because they would be responsible for enforcing the law. And in this case, we are now looking at increasing any static signage from 200 square feet, and this is how I'm reading it, to 1,000 square feet? Mr. Speaker, this could be the beginning of Sign City. When we were discussing legislation on campaign signs, there were some serious concerns of signs being placed on public property. So the signs were restricted to an equivalent of 32 square feet, political signs. That was the transition, because signs were just too large on public property. And now we transitioned to restricting political signs in public property. But we are talking, Mr. Speaker, about allowing, without regulatory review, of allowing a static sign to reach a dimension of 1,000 square feet. That, I think, Mr. Speaker, is a little bit too much. Even with all of these deviations, you mentioned that the regulatory entity in this case could review variances, and it could be unlimited to some extent. But this is already only allowing big business to be able to put up signs equivalent to 1,000 square feet without going to a regulatory body, so that in fact the purpose of the sign, the location of the sign, the dimension of the signs would be reviewed and finally considered by the government of Guam. So I stand in opposition of this amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Ada, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you know, I guess just to imagine how large is 200 square feet. So the existing digital signs that you see out there, the one in front of Docomo, the one at the ITC intersection, that sign is approximately 200 square feet in dimension. Now, if we were to allow 1,000 square feet, let's say over the ITC intersection, if I was heading north, I probably wouldn't be able to see that beautiful new Camacho building and the nice building where that sign sits on. I mean, that's what 1,000 square feet will do. The sign, the static signboard that is up there by Nissan, that used, I think that actually got reduced. But at one time, it was a lot larger than what you see up there right now. So I would object also to allowing for the static billboards to go up to 1,000 square feet. Thank you.
Senator Rodriguez, then Senator Nelson. Any other senator after these two? Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I understand the rationale behind the mover's intent. However, just listening to some of our colleagues and some of the discussion, perhaps a middle ground needs to be sought. And looking at the committee report of this bill, Mr. Speaker, there was testimony provided that a current static sign in a community, I believe the one in Upper Tumon, has been approved it's approved for a 400 square feet size. And if this bill passes as it's written, that sign would now become a legal non-conforming sign. And if this bill passes as is as well, it would now require the static signs be smaller than that 400 square feet sign that would now be legal. And so it doesn't it wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be fair now for a new applicant to come in under these rules to have to conform with the 200 square feet size limit when previously the government has already issued a 400 square foot signage and this bill affirming that authorization. And so perhaps instead of 1,000 square foot sign, Mr. Speaker, that a middle ground here would be to adopt the 400 square foot size for static signs, just to ensure there's consistency with what the government has already authorized. And so at this point, Mr. Speaker, I move to amend the amendment from 1,000 square foot to 400 square foot for static signs.
On the amendment to the amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Senator Estevez.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the concerns for fairness, but I think it's important to recognize that there are key differences between illuminated signs and static signs as it's defined within the bill. I believe that the issue, and one of the issues that was looked at, was the safety issue with digital signs that are 400 feet or greater. I think a balance of 200 square foot digital signs and 400 square foot static signs, I think applies for a balance, because really it's going to depend not necessarily on what company is providing which sign, but based on the location, what's safest for the motorist. Whether that's a digital sign or whether that's a digital sign at 200 feet or a static sign at 400 feet, But ensuring the safety of motorists, I think, is going to be key, and that piece of property that they're going to be installing the sign will be able to accommodate that based on the regulatory authorities. But I think if we're looking at it as a one size fits all, as 400 across the board, I don't think necessarily that that allows for enough flexibility. Allows for enough flexibility with considering safety in mind. So I do oppose this amendment, and I think there are other options that we can look at, Mr. Speaker.
Is your opposition to the amendment to the amendment?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. Any other senator? Any other senator on the amendment to the amendment? Senator Nelson, then Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just real quick, I want to remind that several months ago we passed a bill that is now law to fix some of the issues that we were facing with the Guam Land Use Commission and the signage. And really, it was to rectify, because the businesses that invested in the signage, the digital signs that they have put up already, for me, I voted on that bill because the process was incorrect. And so now we're here faced with debating signs, how big they should be, and now we're going to make another compromise, because one business got approved for 400 square feet. And I want to, I rise in opposition, because for how much longer are we going to continue this game, or how much longer are we going to compromise with bending to the will of the body for one business, when we know that 400 square feet, even if it's a static sign, causes a distraction when you're driving, also visual pollution. Guam is not a huge city. Guam is not like LA. Guam is not like Las Vegas. Guam is not like New York. Guam is a tropical island with very little mileage, 36 miles long, 6 to 8 miles wide. And here we are trying to develop these laws with excessive numbers to compromise or complement several businesses. But we make this rule now to increase the square footage. It's going to impact not just that one business, but it's going to impact everyone else. We're opening the doors. It's like opening Pandora's box. Like the previous speaker from Georgia said, it's going to be Sign City. And I rise in opposition of this amendment and the amendment to the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just a point of information, Mr. Speaker. I had misunderstood the amendment to the amendment as being 400 for both digital and static signs. I do understand the amendment to the amendment now being 200 for digital signs and 400 for static signs. And I do support that proposition in the amendment to the amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Lee. Any other senator on the Rodriguez amendment to the amendment? Senator Ada.
I would, well, first of all, I object to that amendment also. And my objection really is just as much on, I guess, the legal concerns. I'm not a lawyer, but I would think if we're going to allow 200 square feet for a digital sign and 400 square feet for a static billboard, and the only difference between the two is that one has electronics associated with it, and the other one is just, a canvas board. I would think that's, somebody's going to be, we'll see you in court, basically, is because there's a lot of money involved in this thing. And, it's why do we need to put ourselves into that? If we can't get the message out in 200 square feet, then, something's wrong. So I object to that amendment, the amendment to the amendment.
Any other senator wish to be heard? All right, there's been an objection to, do you wish to close?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just want to make a clarification here. Is that what I'm trying to do here, Mr. Speaker, is make it fair and ensure there's a level playing field. We have a sign right now that has been approved for a static sign for 400 square feet. A provision of this bill, and I'll stand corrected if someone corrects me here, now says that a static sign must be 200 square feet. But we already have a current sign out there, that's a static sign that's 400 square feet. And a provision of this bill here would actually grandfather that 400 square foot static sign. So if I'm another individual, another business that wants to come in and also build up a sign, I'm limited now to that 200 square foot. So one of my colleagues here said, are we bending for one business? What I'm trying to do is ensure that the next business and the business after that is on the same level playing field as that one that we are grandfathering with this bill. And so that's a very important clarification that needs to be made. Another clarification, and Senator Esteves had withdrawn his opposition, is that yes, I'm not touching the size of what this bill calls for digital signs, which will remain at 200 square foot. The only thing I'm amending here is ensuring that the current amendment of 1,000 square foot is now 400 square foot, something that the government already has set precedence on, Mr. Speaker, by authorizing one of the signs to be erected, and by this bill affirming, grandfathering that piece of sign to be legal non-conforming. So I ask my colleagues to please support this amendment to the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. There's been an objection to the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment to the amendment reading 400 feet rather than 1,000, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes. On the do you wish to, Senator Augustine, you still have the floor.
Mr. Speaker, on the other amendments I have, then I'd have to adjust the numbers to match the 400 square feet on the static display.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker, we're still on the original amendment. That was just the amendment to the amendment.
On the original amendment of 1,000 square feet, there's been an objection. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, did that last amendment to the amendment fail?
It passed.
It passed, so we're now looking at an amendment that's, we'll say, for digital signs, 200 square feet, for static signs, 400 square feet. And I guess I would like to pose a question to the author, if he could tell us for sure what is the size of the current digital signs and what is the size of the current static signs? Or maybe the author of the bill?
Yes. My colleagues, currently the static sign, the digital sign is 200, and the static up at the Cube, up in Upper Tumon, is 400. And I've got the email from them asking that they be able to stay in business.
Madam Vice Speaker, do you have any further questions? Do you still have the floor? So on the original amendment, Do you wish to
Mr.
speak?
Speaker, I would like to pose a question to the author of the bill, if he would yield. What is the science behind the 200 square feet for digital signs? I mean, I heard, I guess there was a study that said at our current rate of, or speed of traffic, that we should be able to see these signs at 200 square feet. And so this was the minimum size, I guess, reasonable to be seen at our rate of traffic. Is there a reason he didn't? Well, is there any, I guess, is there any other information that he could help us with in regards to this 200 square feet? Mr. Speaker.
To yield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the size of the signage is actually, there's a correlation between that and the speed that's allowed for the traffic. And so I guess the industry, from their calculations, at an allowed speed of 35 miles per hour, 200 square feet is more than adequate to be able to get that sign in sight, and by the time you pass it, you would have actually taken in the information. So that is the best that I can do to answer that, but it's not an arbitrary figure. There are some calculations that goes with it.
Mr. Speaker, if I may ask just one more question. And the current law, how big can signs be under current law, the signs for businesses that are not off-premise? What are those restrictions, if I may ask?
Do you yield?
I mean, if I guess we'll have to take a recess so we can take a look at the law, but I don't understand the connection between the on-premise signs. For example, the on-premise signs, if it was to be put on the side of the building, I think you're only allowed to cover 10% of that wall space. But then you have some freestanding signs, such as, I guess, what you would have like a McDonald's. I'm not sure what, I think the sizes of that is more so the height, so that you don't have a car running underneath it and tearing off the roof and whatnot, and how far out over the right-of-way that it sticks out. But I mean, those details are in the law, and I'm sure DPW also has them. I don't know the details.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the sponsor for yielding. I guess I'm just trying to make sense of, this number, 200 versus 400 versus 1,000, and what does it do for the people of Guam? Obviously, this bill would make a huge exception to our sign laws and allow advertising that is not currently allowed. Right now, we're not allowed to advertise for businesses unless you're advertising on the building of that business, on premise. So this opens up off-premise advertising even beyond the bills that were passed previously by this legislature for those electronic signs. And I'm curious, I mean, I've asked legal for their assistance because I think it's not very clear how this interacts with current sign laws. For example, if my business, I can advertise my law practice on a very limited sign on the building where I practice law, yet I can go out and pay for a sign on the adjacent property that's vacant and put up some 200-foot sign. I'm not sure what we're going to end up looking like with this type of practice, and I'm not sure where why we're really going to allow that. We're trying to balance the interests of business who need to advertise, who we want to be able to advertise for their businesses, and current law allows that. They allow businesses to advertise on the structure where they are located. This allows, we actually, Mr. Speaker, have concerns with our existing sign laws because, as you can see, Tumon, that's probably the #1 place of concern. What are we advertising to our tourists? And what languages are we advertising? What types of images are we putting up there? This law doesn't doesn't address those things. It really just addresses off-premise versus on-premise and sizes. And I think this has the potential to really take those concerns that we have regarding, the current advertising and put them all over our island. And we all know this talks about certain residential versus agriculture zones are not allowed to put signs, but commercial properties are. And we've seen this, Mr. Speaker. Our island, we've got zoning is scattered. It's inconsistent, and within a village, you can have a commercial property right next to an agriculture, right next to a residential, and one person's allowed to put up a giant billboard, one person's not allowed to put up anything, and I'm not even sure, but for this one particular amendment, I guess I'm trying to figure out where if this would allow a bigger space, a bigger sign for static versus digital. And I actually think that the digital allowance is already quite big, 200 square feet. If this is the size of the existing digital signs, then I think that's pretty big for Guam, and to allow, I don't know. I agree with the previous speaker that at least when the Guam Land Use Commission was reviewing these signs, they reviewed them on a case-by-case basis. They were considering the entire size of the properties that the signs were being put on, the distance from the roads, the distance from traffic. We have to hope that they were reviewing all of those things, and all other agencies were able to weigh in on those decisions by the Guam Land Use Commission. Safety agencies, historic preservation agencies. What are we going to do? Do we allow a sign to be put up right in front of our historic properties? Because that's, the adjacent landowner now can put up any kind of sign he wants. I don't know. I think there are some concerns with this amendment, Mr. Speaker, so I thank you.
Any other senator wish to be heard? Any other senator wish to be heard? Do you wish to close? I believe the original amendment is now 200 and 400. Is that correct? Has been amended down. All those in favor of the amendment? Please indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes. Your second amendment, Senator Snogestein.
Mr. Speaker, based on the amendment on the first, then the numbers would just change, or just stay as 25 feet, because it'll meet the 400 square feet. The second amendment will be withdrawn. Basically.
Second amendment has been withdrawn. And that's the 25 and 50, right? Is that correct, Senator Snogestein? You didn't number them, but the second amendment would be the 25 and 50 face with. You're withdrawing that one?
Yes, sir.
Your third amendment on the height.
I'm withdrawing that also.
And your fourth amendment.
That's correct. The fourth amendment, Speaker, the minimum distance from intersection of 100 feet from each road. Currently, basic amendment actually is just to bring down that the static sign be eight feet from the edge of the road. And the reason why I brought that up is because, just to remind my colleagues that earlier this year, we passed two bills. It's ironic. We passed two bills, 138 and 95. 95 deals with the digital sign. You can go out there and measure it. It's not 100 feet. It's not 20 feet from the edge of the road. And if you look on Bill 138, which is the political sign, it said 80 feet. Just trying to be consistent with what bills we pass. That's all I'm asking. That's all the amendment was, to be consistent. The minimum distance between signs, is to eliminate the 3,500. And the reason for that is that if you, I beg your pardon?
There'll be two amendments here, please, so that we can vote on each one separately. Let's take the one of the distance from the road
Okay,
first.
the 10 and the 8 foot.
Senator Lee and then Senator Uggan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just would like clarification if the mover of the amendment would so yield. So I see the underlined section, which would, I guess, amend it to 10 feet from the edge of road for digital signs and 8 feet from the edge of road for static signs. But the minimum distance from the intersection, 100 feet from the edge of the road,
Let's take these two separate ones, all right?
I understand, but my question is, with regard to this minimum distance from the intersection, 100 feet from the edge of the road, that's in the existing bill that we're discussing, but it's not stricken in this proposed amendment, so it's just a little confusing. I just would like clarification from the mover of the amendment.
Can I have a recess, Mr. Speaker?
Senator San Augustine, you still have the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to withdraw that last amendment, but replace it with another amendment that actually puts in the proper format that my colleagues would understand.
Hearing no objection to the withdrawal of the initial, and we now have before us the one with the boxes so that we understand the amendment on line 12 on page 9. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you see on the amendment, it's to add the 10 feet from the edge of the road for digital signs, and 8 feet from the edge of the road for static signs. And to also eliminate the 3,500 feet between signs. And I introduced that because basically, if we wanted to maintain that 3,500 3,500 feet between signs, a lot of signs will have to come down after passage of this bill. Okay? Are we still on line?
Let's take them.
One at a
Do you
time.
want them both at the same time?
Yeah, both. No? One?
Senator Ogden.
We'll separate it then.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, certainly removing the restriction of the between signs, 3,500 feet, I certainly support that. The one thing I would like to recommend, Mr. Speaker, is the first sentence on the left from intersection. It really should read 100 feet from the intersection from the edge of the road, semicolon, and then apply the other two restrictions. Only because this is under the title of from the intersection, and then you would segregate the two, because the original legislation restricted any signage, large signage from the intersection by 100 feet. So I'm trying to make sure that in fact that particular provision is retained. So I would recommend, Mr. Speaker, that that 100 feet from the intersection, from the edge of, and then just delete from the edge of the road, semicolon, because the other two provisions apply to static as well as digital signs. Just for clarity, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the amendment? Well, there's an amendment to the amendment to remove from the edge of the road. Because would the original author of the bill want to make the correction in his bill so that it's understood? Or was that the intent? That the signs would be 100 feet from the edge of the road or from the edge of the intersection? Senator Ada? How did you intend this to read in your introduction?
That actually should be from the edge of the intersection. However, I also want to point out that on page 10, on line 12, talks about setbacks, and it talks there about minimum setback distances shall be 10 feet from the edge of the property line, the private property line, because these signs will be erected on private property. And so as with everything, when you build on private property, there is a setback. So the setback here is being, and then, of course, from the intersection, 100 feet from the intersection. So like if you take ITC, you would take where the two roads cross, and measure it from that intersection there down the center line, 100 feet in. And the whole idea is so that you don't have this intersection so cluttered that the traffic coming down from let's say from Atkins Crow going down towards Agana cannot see traffic that's coming down from on Chala and San Antonio going south. So that's the rationale for, you know, having this minimum distance back from the intersection. But then in addition to that, there's a setback from the private property line that sign is on.
And so on the amendment that's being proffered, as it relates to your initial intent,
you know, this is an important bill, so I would move to set this aside, and let me get some verifications and get this particular point clarified so that it is with absolute certainty as to really what those setbacks are going to be.
thank you very much. On the motion to set this bill aside in discussion and move on, I've been advised that 262 and 270 have still not cleared core, so let's go on to 216. Senator Adda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Page. Winston. Mr. Speaker, Bill 216, I move to place Bill 216-34 LS into the third reading, and I would like to discuss it.
On that motion, hearing no objection.
Thank
you're
you.
recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Bill 216 does one thing. What it does is it grants administrative jurisdiction of a 4-acre portion of a parcel of property down adjacent to the Port Authority to the Guam Customs and Quarantine Agency. Now, what I've passed out is an aerial graph, two aerial photos of the property that we're talking about. You'll see there in the first as an orientation, outlined is parcel 1-3, and to the north east is there's the arrow that points to where the weigh station is. Now, in the Port Master Plan of 2008, it was actually in that particular master plan, there was a portion of property that was set aside right towards the western edge of parcel 1-3 to construct a customs inspection facility. And how that facility would be used is when customs identifies a certain container that needs to be set aside, devanned, and go through it with a fine-tooth comb, they would basically drive. This would be the area where, assuming that a facility has been constructed, bring in that container, devan it. It's a sterile area, and only customs inspectors will be in there to see if, in fact, there's any prohibited items being shipped in. In the master plan update of, I believe it was 2013, for some reason, the proposed site for an inspection facility was removed. Now, we talk a lot about, needing to protect our borders. So up at the airport, where the bill is going to be introduced to increase the passenger fees to generate funds to be able to provide the resources for that particular inspection facility. Down at the port, there's really nothing. At one time, prior to the recent renovation that's been taking place, the port did have a large warehouse to be able to do this sort of thing. Take in a container, isolate it, devan it, inspect it, and move it on. Now that particular facility has been demolished, and so the only thing that Customs has down there is they have this mobile X-ray machine that they would identify maybe 10 containers, line it up, and they'll drive the mobile X-ray, and then if they think there's something that's not proper, that looks kind of suspicious inside, they don't really have a place to be able to devan it. And if they devan it there, if there's inclement weather, it doesn't make for a good. So I guess out of futility there, they just say, I don't know how they handle it, but it certainly doesn't present for a good situation. Now, when the bill was introduced, that would set aside, and let me just state this, Parcel 1-3 does not belong to the Port Authority of Guam. It belongs to the government of Guam, but it is not under the jurisdiction of the Port Authority. So that's why this bill is being introduced to explicitly earmark a 4-acre piece, and the bill goes in and talks about preferably at the exit, at the point where containers would normally exit. Now, when the bill was introduced, the port came in and said, well, why don't you give us a chance to speak, sit down with the Customs, and we'll try and work something out. Well, so that was, I believe, in February. We came back in, I believe, early June, late March, early June, to find out, okay, so did you guys come to any kind of an agreement? And the agreement that they came up with was, yeah, in the meantime, we'll allow the Customs to have a portion of a warehouse, and basically, on the one side, on one half of it, they can use that for inspections, but it's really not an isolated, it's not a sterile condition. And so that's what's being offered for now. Insofar as property, to be able to build a facility, the port decided, well, they should have the property that's directly north. So if you see right almost to the left of where the weigh station is, the port suggested that's where the Customs and Quarantine Agency should build their inspection facility. So on the second handout, you can see basically the area that is being generously given to Customs. And that's an area that is not protected from the ocean. Certainly the ideal is that it would be on the south side of the breakwater. The area that's being suggested that the port Customs should have is actually right by the ocean, and a good storm surge certainly would fill that in. And what it's being used for now is that's where we're storing a lot of the salvage cars and whatnot that's getting ready to be shipped off island. And so I don't think that is really a good place to eventually construct an inspection facility for Customs. So, I'm proposing then that we go with Bill 216-34, which specifically grants administrative jurisdiction of a 4-acre portion, as shown on a map, which I believe is attached to the bill. and for the purpose of developing and constructing a custom satellite inspection, holding, and secured sterile facility for the use of the Customs and Quarantine Agency. So it starts with this. We've got to provide them with a piece of real estate where they can construct the facility, and now that they have this in hand, they can go and look for federal grants to be able to construct their facility. But the first thing is, you can't go be putting in an application for a grant, and then they ask you, do you have a place to build it? And then their response will be no. So this will be the first step towards that ultimate goal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Nelson. Any other senator after Senator Nelson wish to be heard on the bill? On the main motion, Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill. We have been having a lot of challenges with the port and really the keeping our borders safe. And so this bill will essentially provide the land needed for customs and quarantine to really inspect cargo coming in and also accounting for items in every container. This was a concern that I had when we were addressing the bond that the Port Authority of Guam was going out to seek, that Customs and Quarantine would not be able to operate without having to pay a high cost in rents like they do at the airport. However, I thank the sponsor of this bill for finding the land needed for Customs and Quarantine to operate without having to be extorted by another government agency. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? Senator Mary Camacho Torres, then Senator Ogden.
Mr. Speaker, I want to commend the author of this bill for coming up with a first step towards a badly needed remedy for not only invasive species, but also providing Customs and Quarantine a presence at the port that is within a reasonable proximity to the yard and the movement of the port. One of the concerns that we have, not only as we look at the threat that invasive species has had on our island, but oftentimes, you know, the ability to adequately isolate and inspect incoming cargo is limited by their operations at present. And so this will, in fact, give them not only a reasonable attempt at addressing items that need to be controlled and monitored coming into our island. The ideal situation, of course, would be to have them within the secured area, but I believe that the proximity can provide for the movement from the secured area to this second secured area, secured in the first instance by the port and then this one by Customs and Quarantine. So it does seem like a reasonable and a reasonable solution for Customs need to have a presence at the port. So I rise in full support.
Thank you very much. Senator Ogden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe there have been some excellent comments in regards to the need for the construction of a custom satellite inspection, holding and secured sterile facility within the area of the Port Authority of Guam. I just have several questions that the sponsor of the legislation would yield. And the first question is in reference to, and he may have highlighted it during his previous statements, but in reference to the parcel of property with the original legislation, are we talking about the same parcel of property, and if in fact that information was shared with the Port Authority of Guam?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield. Mr. Speaker, the bill that we're discussing is the bill as introduced, so there was actually no amendment to it. And so after the port did ask to give them some breathing, some time to be able to sit down with customs to discuss this, we did. And then afterwards they came and we sat down I sat down with them to get briefed as to, so what was the results of the discussion, and basically what I had told the body as to at least the port's solution. And quite frankly, I'm disappointed in customs that they were quite silent, and I think they got steamrolled in this thing. And so I'm stepping up and I'm basically saying I think Bill 216 should go forward as introduced.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the sponsor of the legislation. And the reason why I asked, Mr. Speaker, is whether in fact there are any perceived legal restrictions from the Port Authority if in fact this property is under the jurisdiction of the Port Authority. They just recently were very successful in floating and acquiring $72 or plus million for the repair and upgrade of some of the facilities. And based on the bond covenants, my concern is if in fact the legislature now is injecting itself into the Port Authority assets provisions, and whether it's consistent or inconsistent with some of those bond covenants, because we know that anytime that we go out into the market, certainly this information, the legislature stepping in and acquiring properties without the consent of some of the bondholders may come into question. So that's one of the reasons why, Mr. Speaker, I asked that question, knowing full well that the Port Authority had to be aware of the acquisition and the use of this property for the provisions stipulated in this legislation. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Addy, did you wish to speak?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. The preceding speaker does bring up a very good point about whether this, granting administrative jurisdiction to the port will in any way impact negatively on the port and its recent $70 million bond. So the answer to that, I think, the answer to that is no. First of all, the conveyance deed that gave back this property, this parcel 1-3, in the conveyance deed from the federal government was that this parcel here was to be used for port-related activities. So certainly customs fits into that. Secondly, what's to be funded with the $70 million bond that was recently received really has nothing to do with this. That $70 million was to be used to pay off some existing loans. It is to be used to upgrade the water line. It is to be used to construct a headquarters, a $15 million headquarters.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, just a point of information. It wasn't the application and the use of the $72 million for the upgrade of the facilities at the port. I was asking if, in fact, this parcel of property is under the jurisdiction and the ownership of the Port Authority of Guam, and whether bondholders were aware of that, because by virtue of floating those bonds, there are some bond covenants that may have been inserted into the borrowing authority that would restrict assets of the Port Authority of Guam from being utilized. So that's why it wasn't in reference to how the proceeds were going to be utilized. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
So as I continue with what I was saying, parcel 1-3 is not under the jurisdiction of the port. Now, if they, if somehow it got slipped into there and tied that in with the bonds, that I don't know. But certainly for what was planned for that $70 million, setting aside a 4-acre parcel for customs certainly does not get in the way of those plans. Thank you.
On the main motion, Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I proffer any further statements, if I may ask the author to yield to a question. And the question is that according to this map that we have on parcel 1-3, there there seems to be some facility right in the middle of it. And I'm just, the question is, what is that? You know,
Right now that you're talking about just almost on the northern edge, I presume, correct?
yes, it's almost like
Yeah.
a square type of
Yeah, and-
clearing.
And that was an area that was actually being used to store your chassis and whatnot. And so that's what that's being used for. But, you know, I think most of that has actually been taken down to by the Polaris Point because they've leased out some property there for storage.
And thank you for that. And then also that when you take a look at the western end, right, it seems to me that there are some port, I don't know if it's port operations on that or if it's port-related operations run by private operators. You know, since the statement was made that this parcel 1.3 is not under the jurisdiction of the port and really is government of Guam land, has there been perhaps some of that area that has, like, it shows like a pavement, and then I don't know whatever those other things are. They might be containers or whatnot. Has there been an agreement or an MOU that Port has the ability to use that property?
I'm not aware of, you know, if that extension there on the southwestern corner of parcel 1-3, if how that, it's obvious that the port operation is into that already. And so, you know, even the exit lane that goes out to the blacktop there, that's within parcel 1-3. I'm not sure whether how that thing has been parceled out, but in the green space there, we know that that's available space. So, you know, I can't answer your question.
Right. Okay, it doesn't, I guess it really has no bearing then on where I stand on this bill. I stand in full support of this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. For some reason, it seems like Customs and Quarantine is not getting its just due in their ability to carry out what they're supposed to be doing in terms of inspecting a lot of these containers that might be suspect in terms of whether it might be contraband or invasive species. And we all know how important that is to our island. Contraband is one thing that has had drastic negative effects on our community, and the port does need a facility in which they can carefully and in a secured area be able to have that ability to inspect the containers. Invasive species, we see the effects regularly of invasive species on our island, not just in terms of insects and bugs, and we even at one time, I believe, they even had a skunk come in to the island. So again, it needs to be a secured facility. I am very familiar with port operations, having been involved with them before in my legislative position. And I do know that there is a very critical need to have a dedicated facility for Customs and Quarantine so that they might be able to do their job in protecting our island. I stand in full support of this legislation. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. On the bill, Speaker Cruz, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I fully support the intent. As the sponsor began his discussion on the bill, he talked about the bill of my wanting to increase the fees. What I don't want is I don't want a turf war between the port and Customs. And I'm just wondering whether or not it is absolutely necessary to give 4 acres I don't want this bill and the intent of giving Customs and Quarantine some land to build on, to build their inspection station. I don't want it tied up because this question about what this paved area down here is and whether or not that should be given up by the port, or what that other square area is in the middle. I'm just wondering if the Customs and Quarantine could fit themselves in that triangle at the top to do whatever they need to do, because I believe that Customs and Quarantine needs a warehouse and an area down near the port. But I just don't want this vetoed or objected to because it takes some paved areas of the port that's down here. So I just raised that question. I just don't know whether or not the entire parcel 1-3 needs to be conveyed or give administrative jurisdiction over, or whether we can just give a small section. I mean, it would seem to me, I've seen hotels built on what seemed to be less than an acre piece of land. And I'm just wondering whether or not we could build a warehouse or 2 warehouses on something smaller and without us being tied up in a fight between the port and the Customs and Quarantine and us passing legislation that's not going to go anywhere because of the objections. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker Cruz. On the bill, Senator Ada, I'm sorry, he wanted to respond. Is there any objection to letting Senator Ada respond? Or Senator
Thank you,
Ada.
Madam Speaker. So the preceding speaker certainly raises a very valid point. And I want to make it clear that the bill does not designate a specific portion. It just says a grant of administrative jurisdiction of a 4-acre portion of parcel 1-3. So that's where really the port and customs are then going to need to sit down and decide where in parcel 1-3 that customs could best fit in. We already know that the port wants to build on the eastern section of parcel 1-3 to build its warehouse, to build its headquarters. But the bill does not specifically say that it's got to be here. But we certainly would like to have it in that parcel 1-3 because it affords the protection of the breakwater. It is within the secured area of the port as these containers exit the port. So, that's where I would hope that the 2 agencies would collaborate, but it doesn't dictate where in parcel 1-3 it will go.
On the main motion, any other senator wish to be heard? On the main, Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to rise in support of the measure and actually speak to the matter that you brought up a few minutes ago. There really should be no turf wars between the agencies and customs. I'm of the mind that customs should actually be somehow given superseding administrative jurisdictional authority on any port or airport properties, because they need to go in and do their job. They need to be able to go in and inspect anything coming into our island. And there really should be no authority for the port or for the airport to restrict customs from being able to situate themselves anywhere they have to in order to be able to properly inspect. We've seen this problem not just in the bill that's trying to address it at the port, but at the airport. I just wanted to put on the record that I still think it's it doesn't make sense that they charge customs rent to set up their operation in the airport at the same rate that they charge the designer handbag stores. If customs isn't allowed to do their job in the port or in the airport, we're not going to be able to bring anything in. So for us to even have to go so far as to do a bill for administrative jurisdiction without the port actually voluntarily doing an MOU of customs and voluntarily assigning whatever area they need in order for them to do their job, it kind of speaks to the underlying problem. And agencies are all under one government, and whether you're autonomous or not, if you need to work with the regulatory bodies, particularly the law enforcement, and particularly in these circumstances where we have these drug problems that we're trying to combat, let's remember we're one government, and we need to work together, and it shouldn't just be about give me more money. We need to do things that make sense. So I'd like to commend the author of this bill for trying to find a sensible solution to this, but we really need to rethink the overall interaction between customs and the agencies that manage the points of entry that they're responsible for policing. I mean, it's like saying that GPD can't go into an agency to do their job if they needed to be there. Customs is a law enforcement agency. So I just wanted to put that on the record, Mr. Speaker. I know that there's, as was referenced in some earlier discussion, another bill to increase fees, and I just don't think that Customs should be getting charged by Government of Guam agencies to do their job, and I don't think that Customs should be in a situation where they're not able to even access the land area or the operational area necessary for them to do their job. These are the kind of management and executive branch functions that we really need to, have made more streamlined so that we're not trying to resolve these things at the legislative level. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too rise in support of the intent of the bill. I'm so thankful to the sponsor that he held his ground despite what looks like Customs' willingness to concede their need for this area, contrary to how they testified in the public hearing that we had. At that public hearing, they reminded us of what requirements they had. Their requirements were to have a secure place, sterile in some instances, to be able to inspect freely, which, as was testified by previous speakers, they're only able to do, under the current restrictions at the port with a mobile scanner, and hopefully this would expand their use of technology and use of other procedures for inspection. They were required, in order to combat invasive species, to have a wash down and treatment facility, and this bill looks like it would allow all of those uses within this area. I'm concerned, when seeing this map that was passed out this morning, I was optimistic that it includes, it looks like, the ingress and egress into the port. Is that correct? May I ask the sponsor?
Yes, it is. The one on the northwestern part of parcel 1-3.
All right, because as a previous, my colleague also, as previous speaker, my colleague also spoke about, I agree that Customs has to have the absolute authority when it comes to things coming in to Guam from the port. We are combating drugs, we are combating invasive species, and frankly, we are losing in these battles. We are losing big. The people of Guam they deserve much, much more. And I think if this is what Customs needs, and I agree with them getting the portion that actually has access to the roads that come in and out, because my understanding is that we have concerns not just of inspecting containers as they are leaving the port, but by that time, you know, there's been other opportunities for drugs and contraband to be removed from the containers. And so I just think giving them, if that's really the case, that giving them authority over what is literally coming out of the port is what they need. And I just, of course, am concerned because there really is no real concrete plan in front of us as to what they're going to build, how they're going to, you know, and use their powers under this situation. And I guess, you know, giving them land, it's a big step, but I really would rather see this is the exact building we're going to build, and this is what we are going to be able to do. And we are going to have 100% inspection if we build this facility. And then we as a legislature, you know, respond with giving them everything they need for that 100% inspection facility. I'm curious too, because of where this is positioned, and because of what the port, the discussions we've had with the port during their bond bill debate, and because they've already gone out for their bond, they assured us at that time that they would continue their existing relationship with Customs, and that Customs would continue to be able to use their headquarters, a space in the headquarters, that they would be provided a space there. Apparently, Customs was able to use previously the container freight station to do their inspections, and I think this facility has since been rendered not usable. But I don't want, by passing this bill, for the port to think that now we're restricting Customs to only this area, as opposed to allowing them access to the areas that they feel are necessary to do the work that they have to do. And if that includes going back into the containers before they even get to this area, I think that I just want to make sure that this bill doesn't send that wrong message. I think it's a good idea that it's within the secured area of the port. And if I may just ask the sponsor again, when you said this includes the secured area of the port, is the entire parcel within the secured area of the port, or only a portion of it?
Well, which parcel? Parcel 1-3, I believe the fencing, the secured area, that whole parcel 1-3 is not fenced off. So there will be additional, you know, extension of fences, or wherever there's a Customs facility is going to be built, that's going to have to be secured.
Thank you. I also want to just point out that at the hearing, the plant and quarantine division that's been incorporated into Customs now, they ask that they specifically, or the bioinspection unit, be allowed input as to any facility that's going to be built or the plans. And I would just like to also put that on the record, that I also hope that that's going to be done. I guess I'm concerned now, since we're only giving a parcel of this property, a 4-acre portion of this parcel, sorry, who's going to decide that, and how, yeah, it does kind of set it up for a dispute. I would hope that Customs and Quarantine would take the lead on this. They can see the opportunity the legislature's giving them to be the leaders, to really stop the drugs, stop the invasive species, and do whatever it takes, and take the lead and tell us exactly which portion of this parcel would be most effective for them to do what we are expecting and relying on them to do as our law enforcement agency. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the sponsor of this bill.
Thank you very much. On the main motion? On the main motion, any other senator wish to be heard? If not, Senator Addy, you're welcome to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the input, the comments from my colleagues. I just want to point out two things. First of all, there was a question about do they really need 4 acres? The 4 acres was based on input from customs. They've looked at a model facility of other similar customs operations, and that's how they came up with the 4-acre piece. Secondly, we certainly don't want to, tie up 4 acres and have it sit there, and then because nobody's doing anything. So on section 2B, it reads there, if the property is not developed into a functioning customs, satellite, holding, and secured sterile facility within 3 years, administrative jurisdiction of the customs and shall expire, and the property shall revert back to the general jurisdiction of the government of Guam. Now, is 3 years a reasonable time? I don't know, but let's cross that bridge when we get to it. But the message here is being sent that, now that the bill's passed, everybody can sit back. Now that the bill's passed, the real work begins. And we've got the 3-year clock is ticking. So I would ask my colleagues to favorably consider this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On the motion to send the bill down to the voting file, any objection? It's almost noon, and I've been informed by by the clerk that Bill 262 and 270 have cleared, so I'll accept a motion. We'll go back. Do you wish to be heard to go back to motions?
That's correct, Mr. Speaker.
I don't want to be corrected, the moving it back from here.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to go back to motion.
On that, hearing no objections, we're in motions. Do you have a motion?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, that Bill 262-34 COR is corrected by the prime sponsor and as amended by the Committee on Education, Finance, Taxation be added to the agenda and be heard this afternoon.
On that motion? The 262 will be at the top of the agenda this afternoon when we resume at 2. How about 2? I understand.
I'm going to make that next motion
Okay.
For also, Mr. Speaker, Bill 270-34 introduced by Senator Frank Bill can be following 262 this afternoon.
All right. Vice Speaker?
Speaker, what bill did you say would be on the top of the agenda when we return?
262.
The one that just been added?
Yes.
Has it been substituted by the committee? Because we haven't seen the substitute version.
Yeah, I understand. That's why we're going to break. And
Are both bills substituted by the committee?
I have no idea. Only 262, as I understand.
Only 262.
All right. The copies are going to be distributed, and we'll take a recess until 2 o'clock this afternoon. And at 2 o'clock, we will reconvene to start discussion unless there's some issue with 262. All right? We stand in recess.